Picture this. It is sometime before the end of this decade. Russian tanks are crossing into the Baltic states. Drones swarm over Finnish border towns. The call goes out across Europe. And within hours, a machine unlike anything the world has seen since the Cold War begins to move. Ports fill with ships. Highways turn into rivers of steel. Rail lines creak under the weight of armored columns heading east. 800,000 soldiers from Germany, from the United States, from every corner of the NATO alliance, are on their way to the front. And every single one of them is moving through Germany. That is not a war game. That is not a hypothetical dreamed up by an academic in a think tank. That is the core of a real classified 200-page German military document. A plan that has just been exposed to the world, and what it reveals about how seriously Europe is now taking the threat from Vladimir Putin is nothing short of extraordinary. Welcome to World Brief Daily. If you are new here, this channel exists to bring you the deep analysis that the headlines never quite manage to deliver. Today we are breaking down Germany's secret war plan, what it says, what it means, and whether it actually has a chance of working when it matters most. Make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and hit the notification bell so you never miss an analysis like this one. Now let's talk about that document. For months, years really, Vladimir Putin has been playing a dangerous game with Europe. His hybrid warfare playbook has been working overtime. Drones crossing into forbidden airspace, signal jamming all over the Black Sea, suspected Russian operatives blowing up infrastructure on NATO soil. Earlier this year, damage was discovered on the Warsaw-Lublin rail line, a critical corridor for delivering military aid to Ukraine. Investigators found evidence of an explosive device detonated remotely with suspicion falling squarely on Moscow. Putin apparently believed he could keep pushing, keep probing, and Europe would keep absorbing the hits without pushing back in any serious way. As is so often the case with Russia's leader, that assumption turned out to be dangerously wrong. What Putin didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to believe, is that while he was busy running his hybrid warfare operations, Germany was quietly doing something remarkable. About 2.5 years ago, a dozen senior German military officers gathered at a military compound near Berlin. Their mission was not to write a diplomatic protest note. It was not to draft a strongly worded letter to the Kremlin. Their mission was to figure out how Germany and its NATO allies could actually fight and win a war against Russia if it ever came to that. The result of those meetings is a classified document known as a Plan DU Operation Plan Germany. According to the Wall Street Journal, which broke the story on November 26th, the document runs to more than 120 pages. It covers everything: troop deployments, logistics chains, infrastructure requirements, medical planning, civilian mobilization, counter-sabotage measures, and at its heart, an audacious central ambition to assemble a combined NATO force of 800,000 soldiers and funnel them through Germany to the Eastern Front. 800,000 soldiers. Let that number sink in for a moment, because it is staggering in its scale. It is the kind of number that belongs to the Second World War. And the fact that Germany is now planning around a figure like that tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Berlin is taking the Russian threat. But before we get further into the details of the plan itself, if you find this kind of in-depth geopolitical analysis valuable, now is a great time to subscribe to World Brief Daily and turn on your notifications. We cover the stories that shape the world in the depth they deserve. Now, back to those 800,000 soldiers. Here's the obvious question: where are they coming from? Germany's own military, while growing, is nowhere near large enough to supply a force of that scale on its own, according to Global Firepower's 2025 assessment. Germany has an active military of around 1816 personnel, with about 34,000 reservists on top of that. Add those numbers together and you are still looking at barely a quarter of what the plan requires. Germany is aware of this. German Army Chief General Allensheim made clear in a letter written just weeks before the Wall Street Journal's report that Germany must be sufficiently ready for war by 2029, and that achieving this requires adding another 100,000 active soldiers to the army by that deadline. That is an enormous recruitment drive for any country. But even a fully realized version of that goal still leaves the 800,000 figure looking impossibly distant if Germany is acting alone. But Germany is not acting alone. That is the entire point. According to Statista, NATO's combined military personnel total stands at 8,652. The active component of that force, the soldiers ready to deploy, 3,997. Germany's plan effectively calls for about a quarter of those active NATO troops to converge on Europe's eastern front in the event of a Russian invasion. A massive ask, but militarily historically not impossible, particularly if what is triggering the deployment is a Russian attack on a NATO member state, which under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty obligates every member to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the genius of Germany's plan, if you can call it that, is not really about the 800 Zalozem soldiers themselves. Any competent military planner can draw up a chart of how many troops you need to stop a Russian advance. The hard part is getting those troops to where they need to be fast enough to make a difference. That is the logistical problem, and that is precisely what Open is designed to solve. Germany sits at the heart of Europe. Look at the map. As Tim Stoy, head of the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security, told the Wall Street Journal, look at it. The Alps form a natural wall across almost everything south of Germany. Troops from Italy or Croatia might be able to hug the southern edge of that mountain range to move east, but everyone north of the Alps, France, the United Kingdom, U.S. forces stationed in Western Europe would have to cross German territory to reach the Eastern Front. Germany is not just a participant in this plan. Germany is the corridor. Germany is the artery through which the entire NATO response would have to flow. And the plan reflects that reality in extraordinary detail. According to reporting from military and the Wall Street Journal, Oakland DU maps out a comprehensive system for moving troops east. Germany's network of ports on the North Sea and Baltic, its rivers, its highway arteries, including the critically important A2 motorway running from western Germany all the way to the Polish border, and its rail lines. Der Spiegel reported that particular attention is being paid to key bridges along these routes because German and NATO planners already know those bridges would be among Russia's first targets in any conflict. The plan also incorporates a complete logistical and protective system for military convoys while they are on the move, covering everything from refueling and resupply to drone defense and counter-sabotage. Now, there is a striking and somewhat unsettling data point buried inside all of this. In late September of this year, the German military ran an exercise called Red Storm Bravo, designed specifically to test some of these logistical concepts on a small scale. 500 NATO soldiers were supposed to land at a port in Hamburg and move east in a convoy of 65 vehicles. It was a modest rehearsal compared to what the real plan envisions. And here is what happened. Protesters, actually reservists playing the role of protesters, jumped from bushes along the route and glued themselves to the road. The soldiers were not permitted to forcibly remove them. Police on the scene quickly realized they did not have the tools to do so quickly either. The convoy was held up for 2 full hours, eventually covering only about 10 kilometers before the exercise had to be adjusted. 10 kilometers in 2 hours. That is the gap between theory and reality that Oakland DU is trying to close. And to Germany's credit, that is precisely why exercise like Red Storm Bravo exist. Not to demonstrate readiness, but to expose the failures that need to be fixed before the real crisis arrives. The plan's authors have a phrase for what they are trying to build. They call it an all-of-society approach to war. As the Wall Street Journal explains it, this represents a blurring of the lines between the civilian and military realms, a concept that was central to Cold War defense doctrine, but has been largely absent from Western thinking for more than 3 decades. Germany is now reviving it. That means hospitals, police forces, private logistics companies, rail operators, energy providers, all of them are expected to be integrated into Germany's wartime function as NATO's central hub. According to Newsweek's reporting on the document, as much as 20% of German highways and over a quarter of its highway bridges are currently in urgent need of repair. The plan acknowledges this as a key vulnerability. The all-of-society framing is partly about fixing that infrastructure and doing it with a deadline in mind. That deadline is 2029. The year keeps coming up, and it is not a coincidence. Speaking at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, German Foreign Minister Jan Vatafel was direct about what his country's intelligence services are telling him. Our intelligence services are telling us urgently that Russia is at least creating the option of a war against NATO by 2029 at the latest. Vatafel said, Russia has largely geared its economy and society toward war. At the same time, Russia is recruiting more soldiers than it currently needs. These divisions without a doubt have their sights set on us, on the European Union, on NATO. The threat to our country from Russia is no longer a distant concern. It is already a reality, and Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius has echoed that assessment precisely. Military experts and intelligence services can roughly estimate when Russia will have rebuilt its armed forces enough to strike a NATO member in the east. Pistorius told Germany's Frankfurter Allgemeine at Zeiten, "We have always said this could be from 2029. In a separate warning, he added that Russia is rapidly building up arsenals despite the war in Ukraine. Some analysts believe the window could be even shorter than 2029. Multiple incidents of suspected Russian espionage, sabotage, and airspace violations across Europe have led some to worry that Moscow is not waiting politely for a convenient date. And that connects directly to another concern embedded in the Oakland DU analysis. The Wall Street Journal's reporting on the plan notes that a potential armistice in the Ukraine war, the kind of ceasefire that the United States has been pushing for, could actually accelerate Russia's preparations against NATO. The reasoning is straightforward and troubling. A pause in the Ukraine war gives Russia time to rebuild. Depending on how long the pause lasts, those rebuilt resources could flow back into Ukraine, or perhaps more dangerously for Europe, could be redirected toward planning and preparation for a move against NATO's eastern flank. The leak of Germany's secret war plan may itself be partly a message, a signal to Moscow and to Washington that Europe is watching, Europe is preparing, and Europe will not be caught off guard. Now, this brings us to the scale of Russia's military ambitions because it is important to understand what NATO is actually preparing to face. In September, Vladimir Putin signed an order expanding the Russian military by 180,000 additional soldiers. That move would bring Russia's active force to approximately 1.5 million personnel. Reuters reported that Putin's overall target for Russian military strength, including reserves, is a staggering 2.38 million personnel. That is an enormous force. And Germany's plan, which calls for 800,000 NATO troops on the Eastern Front, is effectively a calculation that roughly a third of Russia's total force is what it would take to hold the line. Whether that calculation is correct is something military analysts will debate. But the logic behind it is sound. NATO's advantages in a conflict with Russia are not primarily in raw troop numbers. Russia has the manpower edge. NATO's advantages are in technology, in air power, and increasingly in naval capability. The trick is getting those advantages to the right place at the right time, which again is what All Plan DEU is all about. Here is where it becomes genuinely remarkable because Germany is not just writing plans. It is building capacity, and one company is at the center of that effort. Rheinmetall, Germany's largest defense manufacturer, has been on a production tear that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. At its facility in Unteres in Lower Saxony, a plant that began trial operations in mid-2025, the company is targeting annual production of 350 artillery shells by 2027. That is up from a baseline of roughly 70,000 rounds per year before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The company is investing approximately $341 million in this facility alone. It will create 500 new jobs, and it is just one part of a broader Rheinmetall expansion that includes facilities in Spain, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Denmark, Bulgaria, and eventually global target is 1.5 million 155th lobby meter shells annually by 2027. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, speaking at the opening of Rheinmetall's new Unloose plant in August, praised the pace of that expansion and called for similar efforts across the alliance in more complex systems like tanks and air defense. Russia, for its part, is currently producing an estimated 4 to 5 million artillery rounds per year. The gap is still significant, but it is closing and NATO's trajectory is clearly upward. Rheinmetall has also been testing something that speaks directly to Oplan DU's emphasis on rapid and flexible deployment. The company has been running exercises in which it sets up and then dismantles full field camps as quickly as possible. In one documented run, a camp capable of housing 500 soldiers complete with dormitories, 48 shower cabins, a field kitchen, armed guard posts, drone surveillance infrastructure, and 5 gas stations was erected in 14 days and taken down in just 7. That is the kind of logistical agility that a plan like Upland DU depends on. Not just moving troops, moving everything that keeps troops alive and fighting. Germany has also begun grappling seriously with the medical dimension of what a war with Russia would actually mean. In a September interview with Reuters, Germany's Surgeon General Ralph Hoffmann laid out some stark projections. He said Germany should expect up to 1,000 casualties per day in a battle with Russia. He pointed to Ukraine as the instructive model, noting that the nature of warfare has changed dramatically and that most injuries in the Ukraine conflict are now drone-related. The Ukrainians often cannot evacuate their wounded fast enough because drones are buzzing overhead everywhere, Hoffmann told Reuters. His estimate is that Germany would need to mobilize 15,000 hospital beds from its existing capacity of 440,000, and that the country's military medical service would need to expand significantly beyond its current strength of 15,000 personnel. These are not hypothetical academic exercises and planning. These are concrete funded, operationally active preparations being made right now in 2025 and into 2026 by a country that has decided it cannot afford to be unprepared. But there is a caveat, a significant one, and it hangs over all of this analysis like a shadow. The Wall Street Journal's reporting on Oplan DU does not reveal whether Germany developed this plan in full coordination with its NATO allies or whether this is essentially a German blueprint that Berlin is now hoping the rest of the alliance will adopt. That distinction matters enormously. If this is a unilateral German plan that other NATO members are hearing about for the first time through media coverage, then the first major obstacle to its success is not Russia. The first major obstacle is NATO's own internal decision-making process. Arguments, debates, competing national interests, bureaucratic delays, all of it could create the very window of vulnerability that the plan is designed to close. A flash invasion of a Baltic state could happen faster than alliance consensus. On the other hand, if the rest of NATO knows about and has actively contributed to this plan, and there are reasons to think they have, given how operationally detailed it appears to be, then Russia is facing something entirely different. A version of NATO that is not just philosophically committed to collective defense, but operationally ready to execute it with routes mapped, with logistics prepositioned, with field hospitals planned, with ammunition flowing, with a combined force that dwarfs anything Putin's hybrid warfare tactics were designed to deter. A senior officer involved in drafting Alplan DU told the Wall Street Journal directly, "The goal is to prevent war by making clear to our enemies that if they attack us, they will not succeed. That is deterrence, not hope, not diplomacy. Deterrence built on credible, demonstrable, documented military capability. The kind of deterrence that kept NATO's eastern frontier safe for the better part of 4 decades during the Cold War. And the kind of deterrence that Europe allowed to decay in the 30 years after the Berlin Wall fell. A decay that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has now shattered irrevocably as a strategic choice for any serious European nation. And here is the final piece of context that you need to understand how seriously Germany is treating all of this. Its defense budget for the coming year is 108.2 billion. That is the highest military budget in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany ever. It consists of a defense allocation of 82.69 billion euros supplemented by 25.51 billion from a special Bundeswehr fund approved in 2022. By 2029, that budget is projected to exceed 150 billion euros annually. And if you add defense-related infrastructure investment across transport, research, and economics ministries, Germany is on track to spend approximately 5% of its GDP, around 215 billion euros per year on military-relevant expenditure. For a country that spent decades keeping its defense spending just above the political minimum, that is a transformation of historic proportions. So let's bring this together. Germany's secret plan, Alplan DU, is a 200-page blueprint for turning Germany into the logistical spine of a NATO war machine capable of field 800,000 soldiers on Europe's eastern front. It is built around the recognition that 2029 is the likely window in which Russia could feel capable of striking a NATO member. It incorporates civilian infrastructure, private companies, hospitals, police forces, and an entirely rebuilt military-industrial base centered on a company, Rheinmetall, that is now one of the most important defense manufacturers in the Western world. It acknowledges real vulnerabilities from crumbling highway bridges to an undertrained logistics force, and it is actively working to fix them. And it sends a message to Vladimir Putin that is about as clear as a message can be. You will not win. Not because Europe is naive about the costs of war. Not because NATO is a paper tiger, but because Germany, the economic engine at the center of the European project, has decided that the era of hoping for the best while preparing for nothing is over. Now, the unanswered questions remain real. Whether NATO's internal cohesion is strong enough to execute a plan of this complexity, whether the infrastructure can be upgraded on schedule, whether 800,000 soldiers is actually enough to hold the line against 2.38 million Russian military personnel, including critically the air power and precision weapons that NATO holds an overwhelming advantage over Russia, and whether the emerging ceasefire dynamic in Ukraine creates more time for Russia to prepare or more time for NATO to get ready. These are the questions that will define European security for the next decade. World Brief Daily will keep tracking every development, every drill, every budget announcement, and every leaked document that sheds light on how this story unfolds. Because this is not just a story about Germany. This is a story about whether the liberal international order that emerged after 1945 is going to survive the 21st century. If you want to stay ahead of the story, subscribe to World Brief Daily right now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is happening in Europe. And check out our coverage of Russia's collapsing air defenses, a development that has profound implications for any future conflict, as well as our full breakdown of the U.S. peace plan for Ukraine and how Europe has responded to it. The stakes could not be higher, and we will be here breaking it all down for you every step of the way. Thanks for watching.